Ed, thank you so much for joining me today. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
So, I wanted to talk to you about Gen Z because it is probably true that Gen Z and technology is something that many of us talk about day to day. I'm in my late 40s. I have a 16-year-old son, and mostly
Mm.
I'm talking about this with people who are the same age or older. So,
Yeah.
I wanted to get your perspective. First of all, what is your interest in talking about what's going on with this generation and what you're facing?
It's hard not to be interested in it because I just think it's sort of affected my entire generation in all aspects of our lives. I mean, I guess the hot take that I've landed on is that I think you can basically reverse engineer anything that's bad that has happened to society to the fact that we have been growing up glued to our phones, which has led to this epidemic of loneliness. Um, and I think that's where it all started for me. I mean, I just look at the statistics, the depression rates in my generation, the anxiety rates in my generation, the loneliness rates in my generation. And I think a lot of people look at that and they think, oh my gosh, what's happening? What is happening to the young generation? Um, and the social media companies will say, oh, well, social media was designed to connect us. So we don't really know what's happened here. But I think it's pretty obvious what happened. All of these events spiked in around 2010, 2012, probably to be more specific, which was basically the year the iPhone came out. My generation grew up on it. I grew up on social media. So it's just clear to me that it's all sort of downstream of our technology, which has done a lot of nice things for us, but it's also done a lot of harm. And I think most people are recognizing that now.
I would totally agree. Back in 2016, I wrote a book on this topic. And I have to tell you, Ed, that one of my big regrets is that I wrote this book for parents to try to
Mm.
help parents navigate this world of social media. Now, many years later, one thing I think that is very obvious is that it's impossible for individual parents or especially kids to be able to compete with the power, the technology, and the algorithms from some of these big tech companies. So,
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about how some of these tech companies are working hard to keep people in your generation and really all of us hooked on social media?
Well, the algorithms are designed to keep you glued to the screen. And they're very good at doing that because they have immense amounts of data. And it's all sort of consumer tested millions and billions of times because they're getting all of this data that allows them to do this. And so, what do you know? It's really fun and addictive to look at the screen. Um, I think what's kind of interesting is I remember growing up, I loved video games growing up, and then I got into social media, and then I was, on Facebook all the time. And I remember my parents couldn't really understand it. Like they sort of looked at my screen usage and my screen habits, and they were like, "What is it with these kids? And how is it that the screens are so addictive for them?" It was kind of like they were witnessing some other species or some different animal. But now I hang out with my parents, and they're glued to the screen. So I think what we've learned is that it was just a fact that the young people got into social media and they got into technology first because that's how technology works. But it wasn't that it was specifically designed for young people. It was specifically designed for humans. And now I hang out with my mom and she's scrolling Instagram half the time. So we're all susceptible to this stuff. And I think the question is, how do we make sure that our susceptibility to these algorithms doesn't get in the way of our everyday lives and doesn't make our lives worse? And the trouble is that most people today are not very good at doing that. I mean, we're just not very good at protecting ourselves from the time creep that these screens have done to us. And you just look at the amount of time we actually spend looking at a screen. For my generation, it adds up to 109 days per year looking at the screen. And you do the math, we spend around 106 days asleep, which leaves us with only 150 days to do everything else. We're spending 40% of our waking hours looking at the screen. And obviously you can talk about like what that does to your mental health. It's probably not good for you that you're spending all of this time looking at the screen. But the other side to it that I think people don't recognize enough is people ask all these questions about, why is Gen Z so anxious, or they feel so incapable, or they don't know how to get their lives together. They can't get their act together. And they don't really recognize the fact that we're actually operating with 50% less time to get our act together. We also have 50% less time to practice all these things. I mean, you think about the idea that Gen Z is extremely lonely and socially awkward, and we don't really know how to connect with each other. Well, our parents had twice the amount of time to practice this stuff that we did, because we're spending the entire time on YouTube and Twitter and Snapchat. So I think that's the other side that we don't really focus enough attention on, which is that we're operating with less time than everyone else did. We're pressed for time. And so that's why I think our generation needs to really start to strengthen up and figure out ways to get our lives on track while still navigating a digital world.
I definitely want to talk about some of the solutions to do that. The number that you mentioned, 109 days on screens. I mean, it really is staggering. But added to that, I think it's fair to say, and I did see this as a parent when my son was in school during the pandemic, we also told this generation, like, hey, the only safe place for you to be right now is on screens, alone, in rooms at a time where you should have been socializing. What have you seen in terms of some of the data around the effects of the pandemic on this generation?
So all of the numbers were concerning starting in, as I said, around 2010. It happened, just over a decade ago. And then COVID did what I think a lot of us knew it would do, which is that it just accelerated all of the trends. But I think probably the most important consequence was just the amount of time that we actually spent with our friends. And after COVID, well, you actually just look at the past decade, the amount of time that all Americans, spend with their friends per day has fallen 70%. And I think that is probably the most significant shift in just the way our world works. I mean, we used to be a social generation. We used to be a social society. And that has completely been flipped on its head in the past 10 years. And so I think it's not unreasonable to assume that all of the weirdness that has happened to America and really to the world in the past few years is probably downstream of that. I mean, that's likely why we're behaving the way we are. And you look at just some of the other stats on this loneliness. You look at the percentage of Americans who report today having zero close friends. No close friends at all. The number is 12%. So more than 1 in 10 Americans today, they don't have any friends. And if you just look back through history, you look at the number in 1990, that number was 3%. So clearly something has gone incredibly wrong. We could talk solutions. I don't really have all of the answers. What I'm really doing at the moment is I'm just sort of looking at what's happening and trying to connect the dots. But for me, all roads lead to loneliness. You take any trend in media or politics or business, and you try to understand what's happening, why are things changing so rapidly. I think a pretty good assumption for all of these trends is that people are lonelier today than ever before.
I think one of the really unfortunate things as well, and I've certainly seen this in my lifetime, is that when I was growing up, there were people and organizations and governments that worked really hard and worked together to protect kids, right? They would come up with regulations in terms of advertising on television. They would figure out ways to keep kids safe. And I think, unfortunately, in this day and age, especially with many of the tech companies today, I think what we see is kind of the Wild West, right? There's no regulation around social media. And unfortunately, all of us adults have in some ways kind of dropped the ball insofar as keeping that generation safe. What responsibility do you think that governments have in terms of playing a role insofar as keeping people safe from social media?
I think that's almost their only responsibility. I think that what's happened is the digital world, for some reason, we've written different rules for what happens in the digital world versus the physical world. And I think like the best example you could give is if there were, a kid's playground, say, or a middle school playground where you had a bunch of 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old girls playing in the playground, hanging out with each other, taking pictures, doing whatever they do. And then you had a swarm of 40 to 50 to 60-year-old men who are parked outside of the playground, luring and looking at the girls. We would immediately call the cops. That to us is a big problem. That's what Instagram is. Instagram is the same thing, except it happens digitally. And, you look at the way that young women are behaving on the platform and the way that men are reacting to them and stalking them and commenting on their pictures. I mean, it's some of the worst human behavior all melded into one. But the difference is it's online. And so I think we say, well, what are you going to do? I mean, it's very hard to regulate this stuff. And I'll only take that argument. I'll only accept that argument up to a point. And I think the argument from these tech companies for a long time has been, yeah, well, it's just really difficult to get our act together on this stuff. These are complex issues. It would be very difficult to, for example, age gating is an issue. It would be very difficult for us, Meta, to figure out how to get kids to not be on these platforms. We don't really know how to do that. And then you start making laws, which is actually what happened last year, and Congress starts to get its act together on age gating and making sure that children aren't using these apps. And then suddenly Meta turns around the next day and they say, oh, we actually realized we can just ID our users. So we figured out the age gating thing, no problem. So I think the behavior of the tech companies and their policies only changes once they're legitimately threatened, which basically means that the onus is entirely on the government to be aggressive, to be strict, to be stringent, and to treat the digital world with the same laws and rules and regulations as they do the physical world, because both worlds should be taken seriously. And it is getting to a point where we're spending actually more time in the digital world than the physical world. So why wouldn't we have the same rules for both?
It seems like such an obvious comment, and I am right alongside you. I am always struck, even just out in our physical environment on a daily basis. If you're riding an escalator, I mean, there are more warnings when you're getting on that escalator than there are when you're logging on to Instagram or these other platforms. Right. It's just total insanity in terms of the lack of will and initiative and progress on this front, and an issue that people have been talking about for so long. And I think second to that, and certainly something that you see when you're talking about economic prosperity on your podcast, for example, I don't think you can really separate economic prosperity with social well-being. And right now, like you said, we have a whole generation growing up who is struggling in so many different ways. So is there any line of like a silver lining or hope or optimism that you see in 2025 in terms of things changing?
It's hard to be optimistic this week, given what is happening in the capital markets and the bond markets from an economic perspective. So I usually actually am quite optimistic about what Gen Z and our generation needs to do. And the place that I start is just recognizing upfront that our generation has it hardest. I mentioned the statistics on loneliness, the statistics on anxiety, the statistics on depression. I think there has been in the past a reaction to those statistics as, oh, well, this is a generation of softies who, we went to war and now look at these kids who can't, hang out with their friends. And I think what I would say is just first up to flat out recognize there's a reason this happened, and it's because of the screens. It's not because you are weak. It's because you, and you just look at the data to prove it, you and millions of other children grew up in this time that made it very difficult for your brain to function properly because of the fact that you're spending around half of the time that you're out in the world glued to the screen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the economic prospects. You just look at overall affordability. I think probably the best place to start is a house. You know, Gen Z is now getting to the point where we are entering the professional world and we're looking to build real economic security. But the median price of a home today is $420,000, record high. The average cost of a home is 6 times our annual income. You look at it for our grandparents, it was 3 times their income. For our parents, it was 4 times their income. You look at the cost of college, where for us, it's 42% of our annual income. You look at it for our grandparents, it was 13%. The median age of a home buyer, 56. In 1980, it was 31. So there's the economic sides to it as well, where we're entering a world that has been set up differently, and it's now very difficult for us to build real wealth on our own. It was actually a lot easier for our parents who were living in a world of cheaper asset prices, both in the stock market and in the real estate market. And we don't have that. The optimism, there's a way out that isn't crypto, which I think a lot of our generation is resorting to. And a lot of them are getting poorer. Those are the stories you don't hear. They're getting seriously burned gambling on useless assets. And I think the way out is genuinely trying to reduce your spend, putting money aside, and investing in the stock market. And that final piece is the piece that I think a lot of people in my generation don't recognize. They think you can just put your money away and okay, I'm saving, but not enough of us understand just stock market dynamics. Not enough of us realize, okay, I actually need to invest this in stocks. I've always said, just go into the S&P 500. That's what you should do. Historically, that's how you can sort of get your life on track and also work very hard in your job and try to earn a real income and try to reduce your spend. I mean, simple economic stuff. The trouble is what's happened this week. I'm less optimistic about that tried and true strategy. We talk a lot on our podcast, Prof G Markets, about ways to diversify, possibly away from America. I don't want to go all in on that because I'm still trying to understand what's happening in terms of capital flows and market dynamics. I'm not ready to make that call right now. But I guess I'm fumbling over the ability to answer the question of optimism, but I think it would be common sense and investing. And those are my tips.
You know, I just want to pull out sort of a little thread there because you touched on crypto a little bit, and it got me thinking in terms of the uphill battle that we face today in terms of the next generation who are spending so much time online, because added to some of those algorithms that are pushing them down certain rabbit holes that aren't good for their health, we also have individuals who maybe aren't the best role models. And I say this especially, I think, for young boys. You know, when you have podcasters out there who are telling them how you know, you should be aggressive and treat women a certain way and invest in crypto. And this is the stuff that is rising to the top. So not only do you have the tech companies, but you also kind of have some of those tech bros as well that aren't exactly the best influence for that next generation. So is there any way out of that for this generation in terms of just getting them in front of more positive role models like yourself and getting them to spend their screen time differently?
I think the time is running out for these, these Andrew Tates, essentially, or people who have made a lot of money from being online and saying controversial things to get hits that will boost their appearance on the algorithm, and then who sell these online courses where they speak gobbledygook but promise that they're going to get young boys rich and successful, and who believe that the true meaning of success is to own a Lamborghini and to be operating a cam girl ring, which is just another term for prostitution. These are glorified pimps. They're scammers. They're rug pullers. That's what most of the crypto industry is. Our generation has been fooled by them. What I do think is about to happen, though, in about, I would say, the next year or so, is the tide's going to turn. And I think a lot of our generation is going to realize these guys pulled a fast one on us. And they treated us as if we were stupid. And maybe we were stupid. Maybe we didn't know what we were doing. But I think what we're seeing especially in the crypto community, but also in many of these sort of manosphere communities, is suddenly all of this ridiculous advice doesn't actually work in the real world. You know, it's a nice sales pitch up to a certain point, but eventually, once these young people start taking the advice and using it in the real world, what I can tell you is it's not going to work. And as soon as it doesn't work, they realize that they followed false idols and false prophets. So I think we're approaching that moment. I think it's been 2 years where they've been very good at marketing. These are essentially multi-level marketing scheme engineers. So they've really known how to get the message out. But you know, I look at the actual advice that these people give and these ridiculous cryptocurrencies that are essentially scams, that are, you know, they go on social media and they pump these coins, and then they immediately go and sell all the coins, and then all these people lose all their money. But eventually you get the gist of things, you know, and we're young, we're inexperienced, so I don't blame us for falling into the trap. But once you've been fooled twice, 3, 4 times, eventually I think the time runs out on these people, and I predict that would happen in the next year or so.
I definitely agree with that. I think we're starting to see some signs out there that people are starting to turn away from some of these individuals who are, you know, continuing to sell false promises and chances at success. And there have been signs even over the past few months. So I think for the last few minutes of our conversation, I think we can kind of end on a more optimistic note in terms of people waking up. It reminds me, when you're speaking, I had someone on the show recently. His name is Timothy Caulfield, and he is sort of a misinformation fighter. And one of the things he said to me is that he said, you know, we are in a misinformation and disinformation crisis, but more than anything, it's a knowledge production crisis, because what's happened is those guys have kind of flooded the zone, right? And we've sort of sat back and lapped up all of this content. But now there's an opportunity where people are sort of waking up and saying, hey, I don't want that crap anymore. I want something more, which kind of brings me to what you're building right now in terms of some of the podcasts and what you're focusing on. What do you hear from young people who listen to you? I mean, what effect are you having on them?
I think the people that we attract are the people who want to hear an unconventional and contrarian view. And the reality is that in the media landscape today, those are the kinds of views that get clicks and that win. Now, there are many, many figures in media today who have highly contrarian views that are flat out wrong. And those are the people that have been winning and that have attracted many of the people in my generation. And I think what they like when they come to our podcast is they're still getting a nuanced and unique and contrarian view without the bullshit. I'm sorry if I'm not allowed to swear on this.
You can swear. It's all good.
And I think that's a moment where they wake up and they realize just saying something kind of wild and out there and edgy doesn't make it right or insightful. You actually have to be well-researched. You have to be knowledgeable. You have to do your homework. You can do all of those things and still come up with an interesting and unique view. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people who listen to our podcast like about the podcast, to be honest. I think a lot of them probably went to just bad news sources and bad voices who have bad opinions. And you talk about false promises. I mean, I look at I don't want to come on here and get political, but it is hard to not be a little bit political this week when we've seen the effects of what a edgy, contrarian, and totally unresearched view gets us. That is exactly what we've seen with the tariffs this week. People liked the idea that it was shaking things up. We're going to turn the world on its head. That's exciting. It's emotionally compelling. I've made this point in the UK, where the same thing happened with Brexit. We love this idea that we can take matters into our own hands and do something crazy because we're the greatest. And what do you know? What happened? Brexit. It was a disaster. The entire country regrets it. I think that's what's about to happen, and what is happening this week. We're seeing a huge sell-off in treasuries with yields skyrocketing. We'll see if that continues into next week. But the world is reacting and going, oh, that was fun. That was exciting. But boy, did we not do our homework, and did none of that make any sense really at all. So we're seeing it in politics, and I think that very similar dynamic is going to play out in the online sphere as well, where we've had a lot of exciting, interesting voices with just plain bad ideas. And it's all of those ideas are going to hit us pretty hard in the stomach in the next year.
Never worry about getting political with me on this show, because
Okay.
we are Canadian. And since the president of the US has tried to or suggested annexing our country, it has only united the country in ways that I have certainly never seen.
By the way, that's the silver lining for Canada. Your country, finally, you guys get to have a common enemy and really rally behind it. We're still divided. So that's certainly the optimism in your country.
Sure, certainly true. And it's happening here. My last question for you, because as someone who speaks a lot to audiences about artificial intelligence and adapting to change, especially business leaders, the one question I always get asked is, what skills should I equip my kids with for the future? And I've heard you on a recent podcast talk about some of those skills that, again, some people might call soft skills, like communication. Can you just leave us with your advice as far as where should parents who are listening spend their time in terms of guiding their kids in a direction that will help them with those skills for the future?
Yes. I think 10 years ago, 20 years ago, the advice to all young people was to learn how to code. And I think for many kids that worked, but only if you were graduating into the software engineering market in around 2015 to 2020. Basically, those golden years up until COVID is what I would say. Eventually, too many kids learned how to code, and there weren't enough jobs for them. And now we're actually seeing there's actually a contraction in the engineering market for software engineers. And suddenly, the value of a computer science degree is not what it was worth about 10 years ago. So the first thing I would say is, I think a lot of parents that my kid needs to learn how to code. I don't think that's true anymore, especially with the advent of AI. I think what kids and children and teenagers really need to be good at is interacting with people. And it's definitely a soft skill. It definitely sounds a little bit liberal artsy for me to say it. But that is the value of a liberal arts degree, is your ability to get along with people, to adapt to new environments, and honestly, to make people like you. That is a huge part of being successful in a job and in a career, is being able to walk into an interview and convince the person who is interviewing you, not that you know all of the details and you're the most well-read of anyone in the room, but that you would be an enjoyable person to work with. That's how we hire. We want people who are smart, who are hardworking, those are the basics, and you need to make sure you have those nailed down. But ultimately, what we want is someone who is enjoyable to work with and who we'd like to get a beer with after work. That's something that has not been emphasized enough for young people. You look at our inability to socialize and to get along with other human beings. Ultimately, being in the market, being in the job market, working at a company, it's all just working with other people. So if you can become really good at that, and I believe the path to doing that is going to college, getting a liberal arts degree, learning about history, philosophy, the sciences, getting a very well-rounded understanding of what humanity actually is, then I think you'll have a better chance of impressing people in an interview, making them like you, and getting along with people.
Well, that is great to hear. I'm definitely trying to keep my 16-year-old son on that path. And I would be so honored if he starts to listen to your podcast and follows you. So I will be sending him some links definitely after the show. Ed, thank you so much for joining us today on the AmberMac Show. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Amber. This was very fun. Appreciate you having me.